Okay, good evening, everyone. I want to thank you all for joining us tonight for a very special talk by Dr. Terry Jones, Polynesian Contact with the Americas, an update. My name is Stephanie Sandoval, and I'm the Public Archaeology Director at the San Diego Archaeological Center. The center is a nonprofit dedicated to the preservation of local archaeological collections. And in addition to our state-of-the-art curation facility, we also have a museum and focus on providing high-quality educational programs for both kids and adults. Although the center is currently closed to the public due to COVID, we hope to reopen very soon and are pleased to be able to connect to you with these virtual programs. Please visit our website for more information on center membership and upcoming events, like our next living room lecture. It is on Thursday, April 22nd. The Fishing Link, a new take on the coastal model of the peopling of the Americas by Dr. Mark Sutton. Info and registration can be found on our website at www.sandiegoarchaeology.org. Tonight, we will be using the Q&A feature, and you can find that on your Zoom control panel. Feel free to submit questions at any time, and they will be answered at the end of the presentation during a moderated Q&A. Please keep in mind that we do our best to get as many questions answered as possible, but sometimes we are unable to get to all of them. I am very pleased to welcome Dr. Terry Jones this evening. Dr. Jones joined the Cal Poly San Luis Obispo faculty in 1998. His research interests include North American prehistory, hunter-gatherer ecology, and maritime adaptations. His area of geographic expertise is the central Californian coast, where he has conducted field research for the last 35 years. He is actively involved in research on a number of issues related to the archaeology and ecology of prehistoric California. We also have tonight a colleague and co-author of Dr. Jones, Dr. Catherine Klahr. Dr. Klahr is a historical, comparative, and anthropological linguist specializing in California Native American languages and Celtic languages and cultures. Her research interests include the original people of the Americas and long-distance relationships between languages. Although retired from the Celtic Studies Department at UC Berkeley, she works with Northern Chumash people on their language revitalization program. So without further ado, I am happy to turn it over to Drs. Terry Jones and Catherine Klahr.
Well, thank you so much for that, Stephanie. And thank you so much for asking Catherine and I to present tonight. I also want to thank Marty Rosen, who initially contacted me about the possibility of giving this lecture. It's a nice opportunity. That said, I have to start off by saying that I'm so disappointed that Catherine and I don't actually get to take a trip to San Diego to deliver this talk. I love your community. I love visiting San Diego, and I wish that we were doing this live, and I hope maybe we can come up with some pretense for us to give another version of this or talk about something else, maybe 6 months or a year down the line. But thanks for having us. Thank you so much. And thank you all out there in the audience for taking some time out of your lives to join us virtually this evening. So I've titled the talk tonight an update. Catherine and I have actually been involved in the issue of a possible contact between Polynesia and the Americas prehistorically, that is prehistoric contact, for about 20 years. But we really haven't written too much ourselves about it in the last 5 or 10 years or so. However, there have been some really significant studies. There's been some real movement on this issue, especially in relation to possible contact in the Southern Hemisphere, just in the last couple of years. So what I want to do tonight, I've found over the years that many people don't know too much about all the different types of evidence that come to play when people are asking or try to answer the question, did Polynesians make landfall in North or South America prior to the arrival of Columbus? I found that this is kind of an area where not everyone knows all there is to know about this, because it's kind of an arcane field. And it actually draws from a lot of different areas of history, linguistics, anthropology, and archaeology. So I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of some of the long-standing ideas about contact, about the possibility of contact. And then I'll get on to the update. Now, one of the reasons that I've found most people don't know about this is it's kind of a, it's maybe a little bit outside the mainstream, even today, for American academics, for American academia. The idea, it's not perhaps as looked down upon as it was, let's say 30 years ago, but still it's highly likely that anyone who's gone to college in the last few decades or in the last half century may have never heard about this possibility. I have degrees from 3 different universities, and I know for a fact that the possibility that Polynesians made landfall in the Americas prehistorically was never mentioned in a single class. It was never in anything I read in the 70s or 80s. So, and I could give a talk about why I think it is that scholarship still doesn't. We could talk just about that tonight. But I'll also say that I actually teach a class on world prehistory here at Cal Poly. I teach it every year, and I'm always looking for new textbooks, and I have still not found a textbook on world prehistory that even mentions the possibility that Polynesians set foot in the Americas prehistorically. And in truth, very few textbooks deal well at all with the prehistory of Oceania, yet alone the possibility of contact. There's a slight possibility. I haven't actually yet seen the latest version of Brian Fagan's textbook. It's possible that he mentions it in there, although I know Brian is a skeptic, so it may not be in there. But I look at textbooks all the time, and this is just an area that still doesn't seem to be front and center enough for people to mention it in introductory classes. So for many of you, this could be an area, something you've not heard about much before, or certainly something that you don't know all the different components of. But the irony is that my poor students here at Cal Poly, they're probably overexposed to these ideas. They don't realize that they're sort of learning about scholarship, anthropological scholarship from the fringe, but it is what it is. So what I want to do is, what Catherine and I want to do is summarize some of the longstanding ideas, and then we'll get on to an update. So we're going to start with some basic background. So we're talking about Oceania, the thousands of islands that exist in the northern and southern hemisphere in the world's largest ocean, the Pacific Ocean. And specifically, we're going to be talking about Polynesia, the Polynesian Triangle, as it's often referred to, which is a subset of Oceania. There are thousands of islands. Polynesia is often referred to as a triangle because of the outlying island groups that define it. So the Hawaiian archipelago in the north tip of the triangle, Rapa Nui or Eastern Island in the southeastern corner, and then New Zealand that's inhabited by the Maori in the southwestern corner of the triangle. Polynesia is defined geographically, culturally, and linguistically. There were people inhabiting virtually all of these islands. They share a lot of cultural traits, and they spoke languages that were very, very, very closely related. Polynesian languages are a subfamily of Austronesian that you see depicted here. It's a very, very large family. You can see that it covers all of Polynesia. And it's also associated with islands. It's clear that we can link the Polynesian languages to people that were using watercraft to some level. Now, one of the things that many people don't know is that almost certainly the origin point for the Polynesian languages is in this part of the world. You can all see my cursor. Yes, Catherine, can you nod up and down? Let me know. Okay. And from this area of origin, people speaking Polynesian languages made their way out into the Pacific. They also made their way to Madagascar. I don't want to talk about that in too much detail, but you would think that the languages spoken of Madagascar were derived from or related to the African continent, but they're not. It's clear to linguists that they're much more closely related to languages over here. Importantly for tonight's presentation, notice that there are no Austronesian languages in the Americas. There's zero evidence to suggest any relationship, any origin of these languages in this direction. They, best we can tell, they originated somewhere in this part of the world and then spread out in this direction and here. But there's no Austronesian languages in the Americas. So when I was in grade school a long time ago, they told us that James Cook discovered the Pacific. Now, I don't know whether grade school textbooks still say that. I hope that they don't. When James Cook got out into the Pacific in the late 1700s, he didn't discover anything. What he found out was that there were thousands of islands and that they were inhabited by people who had already gotten there before him. Immediately when Europeans returned from, Cook wasn't the only one, of course, but when Europeans returned and reported that they had been beaten, that they had not gotten to the Pacific first, one of the questions that came up were, okay, where did these people come from? When did they arrive? And how did they accomplish it? And of course, the Cook expedition they could already understand the answer to how. They recognized, this is an image from the Cook expedition, that the inhabitants of Polynesia had really sophisticated watercraft. They had sailing vessels with outriggers. They had catamarans with houses. They had catamarans with sails and houses. The Cook expedition recognized that they had sophisticated sailing vessels and that they had the capability to sail and navigate. So that part of the equation was apparent to the Cook expedition, but the question of exactly when and where people came from remained an issue, and it's something that scholars have been addressing ever since. Based on a combination of archaeology and linguistics, we can put forward a scenario, a most likely scenario for when and how the Pacific was settled. So again, we have the origin of Austronesian languages in this part of the world. And then people from here, using watercraft, of course, slowly advanced. And we're going to be talking about this advance here into what's today often referred to as near Oceania, previously referred to as Melanesia. We can trace people with watercraft making some fairly long distance voyages, island hopping from island to island, moving in a generally southeasterly direction out into the Pacific. And a little, this is just a blow up of near Polynesia, near Oceania, Melanesia. We can actually track the movement of people from island to island in this part of the world with this sophisticated pottery called lapita pottery, which has a very, very distinctive color and especially this punctate style. We can see it showing up in islands and sort of with people moving from west to east. And we can date the arrival of people with lapita pottery to this eastern edge of near Oceania or Melanesia, Fiji, by about 3,000 years ago. And then they make a jump, if you will. We see lapita pottery entering into what's now referred to as Polynesia at Samoa between about 3,000 and 2,900 years ago. Now, all of this required some fairly decent seafaring, there's no scale on this map, I apologize, but we're talking about voyages of about 300 to 400 kilometers across open water in order to accomplish this colonization of Melanesia and then Western Polynesia. So from there, we see the arrival of people into Central Polynesia. And this required even further voyaging, about 800 to 1,000 kilometers of open water to get to Central Polynesia. The Society Islands and Marquesas Islands, we think that this is the general vicinity. I apologize for having to use this map. You can ignore these dates. These dates came with the map. They're no longer considered accurate. But the date that's generally accepted, although a lot of the dating in Polynesia is contentious, but Central Polynesia, people seem to have arrived there about 2,200 years ago or 200 years BC. From there, we see people, Polynesians, engaging what I consider to be one of the most fascinating episodes in the prehistory of humanity. And that's people making very, very long voyages to the outer limits, the triangle points, if you will, of Polynesia. And the dates for the arrival of people to these islands are disputed. New Zealand is actually pretty solid, AD 1200. Nobody disputes that one. They arrive in Rapa Nui or Easter Island somewhere between AD 800 and 1200. And then the Hawaiian archipelago also disputed somewhere between AD 800 and 1200. The later dates are put forward by proponents of what's called the short chronology, arguing that, that all of these outposts were discovered in the 1200s. And the proponents of this later date say that there was this incredible wave of exploratory seafaring by Polynesians in the 1200s. And that may very well be, but there's also some evidence on Rapa Nui and Hawaii for them actually getting there earlier, and that it was a longer process. But the facts remain that they discovered these, and almost certainly, I would say that there's a pretty much of a consensus today that the discovery of these distant outposts was part of a process of intentional exploratory voyaging on the part of the Polynesians after they got to Central Polynesia, to the Marquesas, the Society Islands, that they were actually venturing out with this program of trying to find islands, trying to explore the rest of the Pacific. And so we can look, people got to these places so we can establish some facts about what Polynesians were capable of. So to get from the Marquesas to Hawaii, that's a one-way voyage of over 3,000 kilometers across open water, and of course, not knowing whether there's something that you're going to find. To get from the Marquesas to Rapa Nui is over 4,000 kilometers, and then a return trip from the Marquesas to Hawaii and back, and we're fairly certain that early on, at least, there were some return voyages. That would have required, over 6,400 kilometers of sea travel. So the presence of Polynesians on these islands basically establishes the facts of what they were capable of doing. So the question then is, if they could cover those distances, what are the distances associated with making landfall on the shores of either North or South America? And I've got the numbers here. So, to get from Hawaii to the Santa Barbara Channel, that's certainly would seem to be a doable passage, given what they were capable of, what they did. Same thing to get from Rapa Nui to South America. And so you have to ask yourself, if they were engaged in this program of intentional voyaging, why would the incentives for that have ended or changed once they got to Hawaii or Rapa Nui? But this really gets us to the question that's at the heart of our presentation tonight, right? Is could they reach the Americas? Simply on the basis of these numbers, you would think that that's a possibility. And the way I've come to think of it, and the way I started thinking of it 20 years ago, is that if they could find every single tiny speck of land in the Pacific, how could they possibly miss the big islands, if you will, of North and South America? So the question then is, what's the evidence? Is there any evidence to suggest that Polynesians actually made it to the New World before Columbus? And there's some evidence that's been around, that's been recognized for centuries. And it's also very, very powerful, pretty strong evidence. And that's the sweet potato. The sweet potato, I just had to add something down here just to have fun with sweet potatoes. So I told you this is sort of arcane knowledge, right? We're talking about linguistics, now we're talking about the biology of the sweet potato. The sweet potato was a New World domesticate. The ancestors of the wild ancestor of the sweet potato is only found in Central and South America. However, this shows you everywhere we have this hatching, shows you places where sweet potatoes were cultivated in the Pacific at the time that Europeans arrived. So the wild origin or ancestor, if you will, of sweet potatoes is somewhere in this part of the world. But the time the Europeans arrived, it's being cultivated throughout the Pacific. And so, you have a few alternative explanations for that pattern. So it's been posed that it's possible that the sweet potato got out into the Pacific through natural, non-cultural, non-human processes, that it floated or that it was transported there in the stomach of birds. It's a possibility that I'll talk a little bit more about later. Another possibility that many historians and anthropologists have have drifted toward, if you will, or tend to favor historically, is that the sweet potato spread out into the Pacific with Europeans. That Europeans, when they came around the tip of South America, they loaded themselves up with sweet potatoes and brought them out into the Pacific. And so those are two explanations that don't really involve prehistoric contact. But the third alternative that has been recognized as a strong possibility for centuries is that the sweet potato is a product, that its distribution is an artifact of human contact between Polynesian people and coast of South America. On top of that, there's a really powerful piece of information, and it comes from linguists. Hooray for linguists. Hooray for linguists like Catherine. The word for sweet potato in South America is essentially the same word that's used in New Zealand. So, if sweet potatoes floated out to the Pacific, it's still highly unlikely that when they got to New Zealand, they jumped up and told people what they're supposed to be called. So linguists, this was a paper that was written in 2004, Andelar and Moiskin note that Kumara constitutes near proof of incidental contact between inhabitants of the Andean region and the South Pacific. So, the significance of the sweet potato has been recognized by some for a long time, and the linguistics are a big part of that, right? Also important in the 1990s, the idea that the sweet potato was strictly, that its presence in the Pacific was strictly a post-contact phenomenon, that was debunked by a discovery made by Pat Kirch. And I don't mean to imply that this is Pat Kirch down here in the corner. That was just Pat. I hope you're not out there in the audience. This is not intended to be rude. Pat recovered archaeological sweet potato remains and had them radiocarbon dated in the 1990s, and they radiocarbon dated to AD 1000. So that establishes empirically that sweet potatoes were present in the Pacific prehistorically, pre-European times. So that leaves us with the option of, okay, how was it accomplished? If the sweet potato represents contact, we've got two options. So one way would be Polynesians voyaging to the shore of South America, getting loaded up with sweet potatoes and maybe some water and bottle gourds, and turning around and heading back out to the Pacific. And, you know, in some ways that makes sense because we know that they had good watercraft, they had good abilities to sail, they could navigate. The Polynesians are the seafarers of the Pacific. But there's also the possibility that this is just a one-way, maybe even only a one-time voyage by people from South America. And this option was advocated for by Thor Heyerdahl in the 1950s. And any of you who are out there in the audience, I can't see you all, but any of you who are my age or older probably are familiar with Heyerdahl and the voyage of the Kon-Tiki. Heyerdahl attempted to demonstrate through basically experimental archaeology that it was possible for people in traditional vessels, sailing vessels, to get from the coast of South America to Polynesia. So he constructed a replica of a South American balsa raft with sails and dropped it in, although I'm going to talk about that in a little more detail in a second, and was able to make a voyage from South America to the Tuamotus. By the time, now these are not, I want you to notice, these are not really greatly seaworthy craft. They were designed for transporting goods. They were mostly used for transporting goods prehistorically, pre-contact, but for shoreline transport. They're not easy to sail. They have to go with the prevailing wind. But Heyerdahl claims that his successful Kon-Tiki voyage got him to the Tuamotus and demonstrated that South Americans could have, and this is where his arguments get very problematic, not just made it to Polynesia, but that Polynesia was settled by people from the New World. And his idea that Polynesia was settled by people from the New World is really problematic because of the linguistics, right? Because of the fact that we know that people in these islands spoke Polynesian languages. We know that we can, with a fair degree of certainty, that they originate from the area of Southeast Asia. The languages spoken on these islands do not originate from South America. So Heyerdahl had it right, or maybe from mine and Catherine's perspective, he had it right that there almost certainly was contact, but there are aspects of his, the way he presented it that are very, very problematic. And again, folks in the audience who are my age may probably saw the Kon-Tiki on TV. It was on TV in the 50s and early 60s. I watched it on the Disney show on a Sunday night. It was very, very dramatic. And but there are a few things about it. I mean, first of all, the linguistics say that Polynesia was not settled by people from South America. Also, and this was at the time a well-kept secret, but it's not so well-kept now, he had to cheat in order to make that voyage. Let me just go back a slide or two here. The prevailing winds, the onshore winds near South America in this part of the world are so strong when Heyerdahl put the raft into the water here, he couldn't make any headway. He had to be towed out to sea about 80 miles before he caught winds that were going in the proper direction that got his vessel to go. And he did make it, but I mean, that's not an insignificant issue, right? If the prevailing winds won't allow you to get offshore. So his scholarship was not strong. And then the other thing is that he promoted his ideas not through scholarly literature, but through things like the mainstream media, like a movie that was shown in theaters. And so he did, I would say, he did a fairly significant disservice to the idea of transoceanic contact. Now, if I was saying that in Scandinavia, I would be vilified because Heyerdahl is, I found this out the hard way one year when Catherine and I did a talk in Sweden. Heyerdahl is still highly regarded, but in the United States, because of the fact that he didn't, there were glaring holes in what he was putting forward, and that he didn't bother to really try to cover those holes up in academic literature. He really became somewhat of a piranha, and as such, really cast the idea of transoceanic contact between Polynesian and New World in a very negative light. And as such, when I first started looking into this, one of my former professors from UC Davis, when I finally told him I was looking into this, he said, "What do you want to do? You want to be the next Heyerdahl?" And he said that to make it clear that was not something to aspire to. So let me fast forward though, because there was some increasing interest. There was a long period because of Heyerdahl primarily, and there are other reasons why it became taboo to talk about this topic in American academia between the 60s and 90s, really. But starting in the 90s and then into the early 2000s, there was a little bit of renewed interest. And the piece of scholarship that should have answered this once and for all was published in 2007 in a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science by a woman who's actually gotten to be a friend of both mine and Catherine, Alice Story, and colleagues. Alice did a study of chicken bones. Now, again, here we go with some arcane knowledge that some people might not be familiar with, but chickens are not native to the New World. Chickens originated in the Old World, and the prevailing wisdom is that chickens only got to North and South America when they were brought here by Europeans. However, some chicken bones were excavated from an archaeological site on the coast of Chile. And what Alice did, Alice got radiocarbon dates and on the chicken bones and discovered that they predated Columbus. They date to the 1300s and early 1400s. And she also analyzed the DNA of the chicken bones and discovered that they originated from Polynesia, not from Europe. So, this was in 2007. And at the time, at least for a while, this was thought to have once and for all answered the question. Yes, Polynesians got to the coast of South America before Columbus got to the Caribbean, and they brought chickens with them. However, and you'll see this kind of thing in the history of scholarship on transoceanic contact, Alice's radiocarbon dates were challenged. There was a group that said that, well, the chicken was probably being fed a diet that was 100% marine. The chickens were probably living on kelp and fish. And so the radiocarbon dates from the chicken bones need to be calibrated as if that creature was a marine creature. And if you do that, then the radiocarbon dates are post-contact. Alice met those criticisms. She did isotopic analysis to show that the chickens were not marine, and that calibration wasn't required. But the net result was there was damage to the overall idea. And what should at the time, what should have been really should be recognized as a defining piece of evidence. Some doubt was introduced, and it has sort of fallen by the wayside. So we're going to shift now. I'm going to start to talk about the possibility of contact in North America. And this is where Catherine and I got involved 20 years ago, over 20 years ago now. In the interest of time, I'll just say that I didn't know Catherine, but we met at a conference, and we secretly decided, at least initially, to look into the possibility that Polynesians had made landfall in Southern California. Now, at the time, I didn't know it, but actually there was a lot of writing that had been done about this in the first part of the 20th century. And there are two pieces of technology that scholars had suggested may indicate contact, that there's similarities between these things. One of them is represented by here, sewn plank boat technology. This is a tamalo or sewn plank boat. What's interesting about it is the way that it's made. It's made from, this is a modern one, but the technique for construction is the same as the pre-contact tamales or tamalos. We have redwood planks. We have holes drilled in the sides of those planks, and then the planks are sewed together, and the whole thing is sewed up. I'm sorry, everything is sealed. The interfaces, the interfaces between the planks are sealed with tar or asphaltum. And when you look at the distribution of that technology, you find that there's only two places in the New World where people made boats with that technology: among the Chumash and Tongva of Southern California, and then on the coast of Chile in South America. However, and all the other boats in the New World are either dugouts or balsa craft or skin craft or bark craft. However, when you look at the Pacific, this mode of boat construction, this is the way boats were made in the Pacific. This is the way they were made in Polynesia. And I have some examples here, some images. This is a South American version. This is a Dalca. It's the least complicated of the sewn plank boats. Here's our tamalo. These cross pieces shouldn't be in there. But here you can see a significant similarity between the tamalo and a Gilbert Island sewn craft, Gilbert Island sailing canoe. A number of scholars had recognized this similarity and wondered if the details of this engineering were the result of cultural exchange between these two parts of the world. And the other technology that's been talked about a lot, we see similarity between Polynesia and California. These are California shellfish hooks, and these are Polynesian hooks. And you can see some fairly significant similarities in design details. You've got this groove here for attaching a line. You've got it here. You've got a barb there. I mean, maybe fish hooks are just so simple that it's possible that people invented them with the same styles in the two places, but the similarities are noticed. Also, there are similarities in composite hooks. These are fish hooks that were made with two pieces and lashed together. These are the pieces, and you can see some similarity between Chumash composite bone hooks and Hawaiian bone hooks. And a lot of scholars in the first half of the 20th century noticed the differences, and I could provide you with lots of quotes, but in the interest of time, I just want to read to you this one that was written by an archaeologist, Edwin Walker. in 1951 that kind of summarizes what many of the early anthropologists in California had noticed. It is not definitely known whether the tamale was strictly a local invention. Possibly it was copied from a wrecked outrigger canoe minus the outrigger. The fact remains that some of the islanders of the South Seas had both shellfish hooks and boats with sides of boards that were necessarily small and short, fashioned from rare driftwood, and the tamale surprisingly resembled the body of the outrigger fishing canoe of Easter Island. So, scholars in the first half of the 20th century were really willing to consider the possibility that they acknowledged the physical similarities, the stylistic similarities, the interesting engineering that goes into a soam plank boat and its the geographic distribution of that technology. But in the 1960s, there was a development in American archaeology that we can refer to as the advent, it's a theoretical development, the advent of processualism, where it became, diffusion was definitely not highly valued as an explanation for why things looked the same or why cultures change, but instead it became popular to explain variability in culture either temporally or across space by relating culture to environment, to demographic pressure. And so there was an explanation that came up in the 60s to explain these similarities, and it's called tuna tagging. And this is a paper that was written in the 60s to explain the similarity in these hooks. And what this says is that, because again, the objective now with the prevailing theoretical paradigm from the 60s onward is that people invent things because they have a need to, and that diffusion is a weak principle to try to explain artifact styles and change in artifact styles. So the idea with tuna tagging is that a tuna would be hooked in Hawaii with a hook that looks like this, but that one individual tuna broke free, wasn't captured. However, the hook remained in the fish's body, and then the hook was transported in the body of that tuna 2,000 miles to the coast of California, where a Chumash Tonga then hooked their own hook into the fish, or maybe got it in a net. Anyway, they captured the fish and they saw this other hook in it, and then started making hooks in the same style themselves. So that was an adequate explanation. To me, it seems rather implausible, but that was kind of the explanation that was offered up for this stylistic similarity. And from the 60s onward, for the next 2 or 3 decades, the possibility that the similarities represented contact was dismissed. And so that sets the stage for Catherine and my rather cautious foray into the possibility, into this issue early in the 2000s. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to talk about how it was we started into this research. But I will say that when I first started looking into it, I was really, really kind of fearful. I didn't even tell my wife for the first year I was working on this. I didn't say anything to a fellow colleague for at least 2 years. And it took us 5 years before we were successful in getting this paper published in American Antiquity in 2005. But what Catherine was able to bring to the table, which I felt was the most compelling evidence that to add to what had already been recognized by previous anthropologists, what she found is represented in this screen. And I'll ask her to unmute and describe the linguistic evidence that she discovered to add to this argument.
I'm on now?
Yes.
All right. Well, the first thing I noticed was that I should start off by saying in the 70s, I was reconstructing Proto-Chumashan from the 7 Chumashan languages, and trying to figure out the interrelations between the different languages. And there was a word for their stone plank boat. And at that time, there was a lot of interest developing about the stone plank boat. And the reconstruction that I got for Proto-Chumashan was something like tomolo'o. Those spaces between the O's, there's a glottal stop in there. So tomolo'o. Okay. And in Proto-Polynesian, this would have been tumuraka'au. I was also at this time not only learning doing Chumash, but I was learning a lot about Polynesian languages so I could, do this research. Okay. And it was the same, it was the stone plank boat. And then I looked down at Gabrielino, which is a Uto-Aztecan language, not related to Chumashan, found out that they also had a word for the stone plank canoe, tiat, and another word, taraina, for any boat. Now, the interesting thing about the Gabrielino is they had around 500 AD arrived at the coast from the east, from the Great Basin. The Uto-Aztecans spread out from the Great Basin. And so they would have arrived at the coast with no maritime technology. So here they are with a stone plank canoe and a word for any boat. And lo and behold, I mean, this was actually easier to find than the Chumashan thing was. Tia in Polynesian means to sow. The T on the end is an absolutive suffix in Gabrielino. And not only that, but their word for boat, taraina, talai, was to carve or adds wood. And this is not a technology they would have had when they arrived on the coast. So they got it from somewhere. Now, I guess people thought maybe they got it from the Chumash or something, but both of them have terms that are clearly Polynesian. So is that enough, or you have questions?
Thank you. No, thank you. We're going to entertain questions for both of us at the very end. So, yeah, I mean, I just was floored by that linguistic evidence, and we had some additional evidence that we brought to bear in subsequent publications. There's some lore among traditional Hawaiians. There's this passage. I'm sorry, I can't.
Pupuhula'ana.
Thank you, Catherine. I was hoping you'd come through for me there. Was the pioneer voyage to Voyager to Kahiki, the land of America. And this one, Catherine?
Ololoi Behani.
Was its name, and this was the reason for the journey. So we had some lore on that side of the equation. There's also evidence in the Santa Barbara area for change in subsistence somewhere between about 400 and 700 AD. And most Santa Barbara archaeologists think that this is when the stone plank boat arrived, and we see an increase. This is numbers of bones of pelagic fish. And we see this rather dramatic sort of punctuated change in subsistence somewhere between 400 AD and 700 AD. Seems to be associated with the stone plank canoe. So our argument was the similarity in construction style of the boat, the geographic distribution of that technology, stylistic similarities in fish hooks, and then this sort of punctuated change. We've argued that this contact must have happened sometime between 400 and 700 AD. Now, our paper was not all that well received. It was pretty soundly critiqued by people both more by people in California. I would say scholars in Polynesia were more receptive, but there was a pretty high profile criticism by Gene Arnold, who said that we were dismissing the ability of the Chumash to invent the tamal themselves. And that wasn't ever what we were trying to say. Certainly, that Shumash and Tongva had the ability, that had the intelligence to develop these things. All we were arguing was that there was a little push in terms of the specific style, the specific engineering of this boat and the style of this hook. And that the fact that these changes happened relatively quickly suggested to us that there was a brief contact event. Okay, so we published all of this in a book in 2011. Not only all of our evidence, linguistic, archaeological for contact in North America, but also all the evidence that was known at the time for contact in South America. And we got to know pretty well a lot of the people who at that time were involved in this research. So I'm supposed to be giving an update here, and that's really my objective. So I just want to finish up now with a few additional studies that have been done. As it turns out, in the last 3 years, this has been a field with some really active scholarship, and there have been some impressive studies, but they focus on South America. The first study, okay, so there's bad news and there's good news for those of you like Catherine and I who think that there was contact. The first news, the bad news, is that there was a DNA study published 3 years ago, seemingly pretty strong study of the DNA, the sweet potato, which quantified the DNA, compared the DNA of the ancestor of the sweet potato in South America with the sweet potato found historically in Polynesia. And what they discovered was that there was an enormous amount of genetic difference between the Polynesian sweet potato and its ancestor in South America. And based on that, the Polynesian sweet potato had to have been diverged from its ancestor somewhere between 100,000 and 800,000 years ago. So what that means is that the sweet potato had gotten to Polynesia well before humans. And so they're arguing that it was a non-human dispersal that got it there. So this is a really, seems to be a pretty strong study. Of course, those of us who aren't DNA experts sometimes have trouble, it's hard to penetrate some of the technical details of these studies. My friend Lisa Matisu-Smith did challenge this study, arguing that, and this comes up with DNA studies all the time, that there may well have been contamination of the DNA. But the DNA, taken at face value, it suggests that the sweet potato got out of the Pacific on its own. We still have the linguistic supports. But perhaps that doesn't matter so much, because last year, there was an even more compelling study. And this is not my own work, and it's pretty technically sophisticated and technically challenging. But this was published in Nature by a large group of people who investigated human DNA, comparing human DNA of inhabitants of mostly southern Polynesia, southeastern Polynesia, and the mainland. And what they found, so they analyzed the genomes of 807 individuals from 17 islands, and they found a distinct South American signature on multiple islands. And they believe it indicates a Native American contact event in central Polynesia around AD 1150. They give you that date because it had to have been before the dispersal to the distant triangles of Polynesia. So it had to have been in central Polynesia, and that's where this would have taken place. Now, the authors of this paper favor the Thor Heyerdahl scenario. Let me just show you, this is an image that's a little bit complicated. I only want to show it to you. These blue dots show the islands where they got DNA samples. And they see that the strongest DNA match is with people, that is with the Native American signature, is with living people in Colombia today. So, and again, I can't I can't go into more detail about this. I can't really answer questions about it. It's beyond my expertise, but it was published in Nature. It seemed to be a powerful piece of evidence to suggest that there was prehistoric contact. Again, the way they explain it, and this is where we get to be critics of the DNA and the analysts, they say it supports the Heyerdahl scenario that, let me see if I can go back to a map. Let's see if I can get to a map here. Come on now. Oh, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have messed with this. They argue that what must have happened, I guess I can use their map, that what must have happened is that a drift voyage of South American people made it to maybe the Tumotus and settled there. And that they were later when Polynesians discovered, they came across a colony of South Americans. Now the conveyance, but it's just like the sweet potato. The DNA argument could also could have be the result of Polynesians making landfall on the coast of South America and bringing some indigenous South Americans out to the islands with them. But the bottom line is that for the moment, this looks to be compelling DNA evidence to support human contact. I just want to end up with a couple of additional pieces of information that are not nearly technologically as complex, but these happen to come from a couple of observations that I've recently been able to make. About this time last year, I was actually just getting back from Easter Island. I got one of the last planes off of Easter Island. I was doing some work there. We were doing high-tech recording of the statues. Just real quickly, the statues are called moai, of course. Everybody's probably familiar with them. This is one of the most famous moai sites. The platforms that they're built on are called ahu. And this is a reconstructed ahu. It's the site of Tongariki. But you can notice the stonework. Now, admittedly, this is reconstruction. So the Rapa Nui folks took the remnants of this ahu and rebuilt it. But you can see that there's not a lot of sophistication in that stonework. Now, more commonly, if you go to a non-reconstructed ahu, this is what most of the ahus on the island that haven't been rebuilt look like. And so between these two images, you get an idea of what stonework looked like in the construction of these platforms on Rapa Nui. However, there is one site that I visited, and I haven't been to all the ahu on the island, but this is the site of Vinapu. And the stonework there, it stands out. If anybody has been to Machu Picchu and has been to the Andes, I lived in Cusco for 2 months. I taught South American anthropology there. This is Incan stonework. I mean, and to my knowledge, there's only one platform that looks like this on Rapa Nui. And in fact, Thor Heyerdahl had argued over 60 years ago that this, in fact, the similarity with this stonework between this Rapa Nui and the mainland is a product of contact. But again, for American scholars, the fact that this similarity was noted originally by Heyerdahl has worked against it as being recognized widely as an artifact of contact. But if you've been to Tiwanaku or you've been to seen any of the Incan stonework at Machu Picchu or elsewhere, it's hard not to notice the similarity. And then finally, this is where I want to end. Just one additional piece of what I think is actually pretty compelling information, and that is when I was working in Peru, I went to the Lima National Museum, and they had displays of Moche pottery. This is, Moche is a culture that existed on the northwest coast of Peru between about 200 BC and about 650 AD. And this was a ceramic vessel that was recovered from a Moche site that was on display at the Peruvian National Museum. To me, that looks like a chicken. Maybe it does. I mean, I think it's a chicken. I haven't pursued this. This isn't published, but I'm going to end with one last chicken image. This is a chicken, also another chicken image on a pre-contact Peruvian ceramic. To me, it sure seems to suggest that the chickens had, if you've got, chicken imagery on ceramics from pre-contact times, certainly the chicken was there before. There's also supporting linguistic evidence for the chicken being present among Quechuan speakers in South America. But we've taken up all of our time. So I'd like to again thank Marty Rosen for contacting us to give this presentation. I'd like to thank Stephanie Sandoval and Dante, who's going to be helping to address questions in the chat, and the San Diego Archaeological Center for setting us up with an opportunity to give this presentation tonight. So thank you very much. And I'll turn it over to Dante, who's going to be helping to facilitate the Q&A.
All right, thank you, Dr. Jones and Clark. My name is Dante Ferenga. I'm the Development and Marketing Director at the San Diego Archaeological Center, and I will be moderating tonight's Q&A. Just as a reminder, you can submit your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom control panel, and we will do our best to get to as many questions as possible. All right. One of our first questions is, aren't the Olmec and their heads that look exactly like men from Fiji pretty good indicators that Polynesians came to the Americas?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting observation. We haven't looked into that one ourselves. I mean, the Olmec heads tend to be on the Caribbean side of that peninsula. They're not on the West Coast side. And they also, to be honest, they predate the presence of people in Polynesia. They date to about 1500 BC. And that predates, I mean, that even predates people's arrival in the Marquesas. So the dating may be a problem with those.
Someone asked, if Alice's chicken bones were correctly dated to pre-European contact, is it possible for animals to raft on aggregated debris? Aren't there documented cases of animals and plants without intent traveling between islands in this manner?
That's a good observation, and I think it has to be acknowledged as a possibility. Animals do raft. It's a pretty long distance for them to have covered. So one of the things that always comes up with this is what's the most parsimonious? What's the most likely explanation? But I wouldn't rule it out. It's an absolute possibility. Sure.
Right. There's a theory that pre-contact Japanese pottery has been found in South America. Is there any evidence to answer that? Is there any evidence of Lapita style in Easter Island or Peru?
Could I say something here?
Sure.
I won't give you the archaeologist's name, but a very, very famous international archaeologist once told me after a trip to Japan, she said, that Jamon pottery looks an awful lot like Central America. And this was not from someone who you would dismiss automatically her opinion. If you're interested in her name, write to me and I'll tell you.
I'm going to disagree a little bit with Catherine here.
That's what scientists do.
Yeah. The argument for the Japan-South American connection was made by Betty Meggers in the 1950s. And she's arguing, if I believe, that the contact would have been at about 2000 BC, which is why it has to be, well, it doesn't look like Lapita. It's not Lapita pottery by any means, but that's also part of the problem, is that this early pottery that was suggested to represent contact pretty stylistically simple in South America. So it's not Lapita. The thing that allows us to use Lapita as a marker of diffusion is that really distinctive style, right? So I tend to be a little bit skeptical of the pottery, the 4,000-year-old pottery on the coast of South America being a marker of contact. And the other issue is that there's an awful lot of real estate between Japan and South America. So because it's always been, for me and Catherine too, I think, to make this plausible, you've got to envision people making the shortest possible sea passages, right? I mean, clearly the people that had the capability were the Polynesians, but anyway, that's kind of a long-winded answer to your question about the ceramic similarities.
Is there human genetic evidence of Polynesian contact with the Chumash?
That's a great question. The work really hasn't been done. And I don't know if John Johnson is in the audience here tonight or not, but there's been a lot of work with Chumash mitochondrial DNA, and mitochondrial DNA shows, well, for California groups in general, all 5 of the haplogroups, but one of them is haplogroup B, and and Polynesia is mostly haplogroup B, but haplogroup B is also in Northeast Asia. It's not. So in other words, native Californians are haplogroup B, but you can easily see haplogroup B coming into California via the Beringia, not necessarily across the ocean. So the problem with that is that mitochondrial DNA only gives you a signature of your mother's DNA. And we're fairly convinced that the exploratory voyages that Polynesians engaged in initially were all male affairs. And this isn't my thinking, but this is a result of this is stuff that's been written by Polynesian scholars, that initially there would be these exploratory voyages that were all male, and then if they discovered land, they would go back, bring more boats, bring a full entourage of women and goods, and settle. But if there was contact with the Chumash, we think it might have been one of those all-male exploratory voyages, and so we need to look at the DNA on the other side, and that work hasn't been done yet that I'm aware of.
Yeah, we really need that Y chromosome DNA. And we'll say one cultural note about the all-male crews. On the sailing canoes, it was kapu or taboo to have women on them at all, and there were special rites and ceremonies that would have to be done if women were allowed on the boats. It was a real big deal. So they wouldn't have just been there on an exploratory voyage. Going back the other way, it might have been, possible.
Right. Well, speaking of the Chumash and Polynesians, someone who has heard one of your previous talks, Catherine, said you showed a giant vocabulary list between the Chumash and the Polynesian, and want to know how big your list is now.
Oh, well, I don't know who that was, but yeah, I mean, it was never a giant list, but I also have some matches from South America, and also there's a couple of other items in Chumash. I'll mention one of them because it's really interesting. The Chumash word for ironwood, it's a very hard wood, and harpoons were made out of it. It's wula, and all over the Pacific, and I mean down in Tierra del Fuego, the word for a harpoon is wele, and I'm pulling this out of my head now, but all over Polynesia too, you have wele for a type of wood. I mean, that's almost pan-Pacific, but I haven't put together a case that I would consider good enough yet for for saying unequivocally, you know, that this was it. But yeah, I have that. And there's a couple of other words too that I'm working on. I didn't realize I had a really big list. It never seemed very large to me. But yeah, no, I'm continuing the work. It's fascinating, but it's very, very detail oriented. You have to dig real deep into the records that are there and just hope that someone at some point, you know, a missionary or a scholar or anthropologist, something, you know, noticed something and wrote it down, because it's contingent on that, whether you can ever make a case for this.
All right, we have a question from someone who is working on tribal relations concerning the archaeological study of the On Your Knees cave in Alaska. And they listened to a Haida historian accompanied by a Maori woman describe the entry of her common ancestors into the Eastern Pacific Rim from the north thousands of years ago. And both of these cultures believe that they split at some time in the distant past, and that the people who had become the Maori traveled south and west to settle in what is now New Zealand. And they figure their common elements were based on physical appearance, art, technology, language, and oral history. Have you heard that theory or seen anything that might support it?
Catherine, have you heard anything along those lines?
No, I haven't heard that. I'm sorry, I wish I had.
Yeah, I do think there's Heyerdahl had a little bit about that. That's the only place that I've ever heard it, and I actually haven't looked into it seriously. It's an interesting idea. That's the only place I think where something along those lines is hinted at, but that's all I'm aware of.
All right.
Something we could look into more.
What would be the difference, if you know, between how the migration to the Americas is taught in archaeology in South America versus North America?
Hmm.
That's a great question.
Yeah, it is.
Wow. That's a great question.
Well, I will just say that from what I've read from the South American scholars, they have to consider everything, not just the west coast of South America and Tierra del Fuego, but the whole Amazonian basin. And there's enormous genetic complexity in both, you know, both those basic regions and throughout the continent. So I don't know how they are teaching it right now, but it's a very complex situation. I think there's a lot of work going on. So keep your eyes open, you know, for the scientific literature about that.
All right, and we have a question about the Chumash and the Tomolo. Isn't the date of a deep sea fish takeoff 400 to 700 too early, given the earliest date for Easter Island and Hawaii settlement is 800?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was one of the issues that Gene Arnold raised, that we don't really have people on Hawaii. See, at the time we started our research, the date for the initial settlement of Hawaii was argued to be about 400 AD, but the dates have gotten younger. And so, yes, absolutely, it would seem that if we accept this more recent chronology for the settlement of Hawaii, then the point of cultural change in the island predates the presence of people on in the islands in Hawaii. Now, in truth, Catherine and I have thought a lot that it may actually be more likely that contact was made with California, not from Hawaii, but from central Polynesia, and it would have been earlier as part of those early that wave of early explorations. But your point is well taken. And that was one of the things that Gene Arnold criticized us for. Yes.
Sorry, before we go any further, you're getting a little fuzzy. Could you try muting and then unmuting yourself again, see if it's a little bit better?
Okay. I'll get closer to the microphone too. Maybe that'll help. I don't know.
Okay, it's still a little fuzzy on my end, but maybe it'll get a little better as we go along.
Okay.
All right. Do you know Do you know how indigenous people from Chile and or Rapa Nui feel about these ideas that they may or may not be connected genetically?
That's a really good question, and I can't profess that I really know. I mean, I just don't have the connections with that community to know. I just don't know. I mean, we've had Chumash people have commented a number of times here in California. I know what they think, and we actually they've often said, they said to us, we know that this is something that happened. We've definitely gotten a lot of positive feedback from Chumash people. There was, but not 100% either. But I can't profess to know. Your question is a good one, and I can't profess to know the answer.
Well, I've talked to Native Hawaiians who also know that it happened. And one interesting little detail was redwood logs from the Northwest coast, especially after big storms, tend to float. You saw that map of the currents, and they float over and turn up in Hawaii, and they're rare. These are huge redwood trees, and they're considered very valuable building materials when they do among the Hawaiians. So they knew something was out there. They couldn't not have known that these logs had to come from somewhere. And so that's just a little note.
I could add a little something. This is sort of interesting. I don't have the connections, but a colleague of ours, Lisa Matisse Smith, has actually been doing research on the island of Chiloé, just off the coast of Chile, which is the area of the indigenous Mapuche. And they've been excavating. They actually thought they had a burial that was going to seal the case once and for all. It turned out the DNA turned out to not show what they wanted, but they have contact with the indigenous people there. Since you have the capability to do Zoom presentations, maybe we could get Lisa to give a talk sometime. You could have her speak, and she could answer that question.
You want to know where Chiloé is on the map? It's the big island right at the top of that long archipelago that starts west of Chile and goes down to the Tierra del Fuego. And we wish we had more language from that. It was a language called Chono, but very little of it has been preserved. So we use mostly, or I use mostly, the languages from further south to look for possible borrowings.
Do you think Polynesian contact with California or the Americas would have been a single one-way expedition? Is there a way to linguistically tell what directions words would have traveled or were exchanged?
Yeah, I don't think I said this before, but the word, the reconstructed word, tomolo'o in Chumash doesn't look like a native Chumash word. I mean, when you work with a language or a language family for a long time, you find words that just don't look, or sound, I should say, like regular native words. And that one just sticks out like a sore thumb. There are others too that aren't necessarily Polynesian, but that came from somewhere else. And so long before I considered the Polynesians, I had looked around at every language, on, well, I wouldn't say the whole West Coast up the Northwest, but at least up through Oregon, through the Salishan people. And I found nothing. I went down to Baja, we have very little on Baja languages, but nobody had a word that was anything like that. It was completely different. And then I go and I said, okay, well, what, after looking at the nearest neighbors to the north and the south and the east and finding nothing, who is their nearest neighbor to the west? Well, it's Polynesia. I mean, you might not like it if it's 3,300 kilometers away, but that is their nearest neighbor. And the minute I started looking into the Polynesian roots, and wonderful work has been done on reconstructing Proto-Polynesian, the words just started turning up. I remember calling Terry very excitedly one or two times and say, look what I found. And then I found that the Gabrielino had this. And then in case you're interested, down the Alakaluf or the Coescar people down in Tierra del Fuego also have several words. They have the Wele word, and they have Kialu is the name for their sewn plank canoe. So these things just started turning up all over. I don't know if that answers your question, but no, I mean, I found nothing that I even would consider a possibility anywhere except in Polynesia.
And someone asked where we can read an update of your list of similar words in Polynesia and the Americas.
Well, I haven't published anything for a long time, but I think this may stir me into getting out all my old work and so forth, because I'm fascinated by this. So I will take that under consideration. I haven't published anything since then, because I'll tell you, I don't tend to publish this stuff or even talk about it very much until I'm really convinced that I have, well, two things. I mean, really a really good case that, you know, not irrefutable necessarily, but it's what was it Carl Sagan says, if you make extraordinary claims, you have to have extraordinary evidence. And I take that very seriously. But when I, you know, when I get to that point, I'll publish some more. And now that I think it's being taken a little more seriously, not just the linguistics, but everything by, you know, a broader band of scholars and some young scholars like the one Terry's teaching, it might be okay to be a little more speculative, you know, pointing out that this is speculation, but building on an earlier case where really it's pretty clear where the words came from.
And we have a question about the east-west currents that would be going, for instance, traveling from the Marquesas towards Hawaii, that would be a challenge for anyone attempting to cross that way. So how does that influence the whole theory of crossing of Polynesia to the Americas?
Yeah, so which specific, well, it doesn't really matter too much. I mean, the simulations have been done about Polynesian voyaging capabilities, and they were able to sail into the wind. There's really no question. They couldn't get as close to the wind as some European sailing vessels, but the way we think that they were exploring the Pacific is that an exploratory voyage would leave the central Polynesia and head into the wind for as far as they could go. And then they had the ability to navigate. They could turn around with the wind at their back and get back to their point of origin. There were experiments with the Hokulea and traditional navigation techniques that demonstrated that they were capable of doing that. But they were able to sail into the wind. And we think, in fact, the only way they could have made the passages that they did make, that involved some sailing into the wind.
And how long would it take for a Polynesian single hull canoe to reach the California coast?
I had an estimate of about a month. And the other estimate of how long we think they could have survived in one of these exploratory voyages. And again, this is somewhat speculative, but perhaps up to 3 months. But anyway, with their sailing capabilities, about a month.
Since tracking the exchange and the transmission of language throughout Polynesia is a large part of understanding movement, does mythology, a largely oral tradition, provide similar insight? For example, Maui is a large figure throughout Polynesia, but his story and details differ from people to people.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, oh no, absolutely. Oral traditions we've looked into them, and I didn't give all of them in this talk, but myths and oral tradition we've looked at those, and there's support from those types of sources. Absolutely. Oh yeah, no, there's more. I read briefly one passage, but there are others.
There's one Chumash story, it's rather famous, about that Fernando Quitzapaua Librado gave to John Harrington, in which Fernando recounts something from the Brotherhood of the Canoe, which was that let's see, strangers came from the north and taught the Chumash how to build canoes. Don't take that at face value. It's a tale, but what it really suggests is that there was a long cultural memory of someone coming to the Santa Barbara Channel and teaching the Chumash or showing the Chumash a new technique, which is all we're talking about is the sewn plank. We're not talking about inventing canoes or anything. But so in a tale like that, yes, I mean, their own history, their own oral history says, yeah, we got this from someone else, or we were taught this by someone else. But I've never understood why diffusion of new technology is considered to be substandard in some ways. That's just a personal thing. I mean, where was a computer invented? Did everybody in the world have to reinvent the computer every time they wanted a computer or a cell phone or anything? It just doesn't work that way with human beings. Human beings are like wired to look at something and realize the potential of a new way of doing things and decide how much of that technology or whether they wanted to use it at all. But it's a real human trait to share around things like that. And also, you know, the old spy stories about, spying on Russian technology, or the Russians spying on us, or, everybody spying. They want to spy because they want our technology. And, nobody who was just at the point where like learning how to sew planks would make use of a very valuable and scarce resource, because those redwood planks were also very scarce on the Santa Barbara coast, although the trees also washed down there. So it's a little long-winded, but I just have never thought that diffusion wasn't a big part of human prehistory and history in modern times. That's just my own opinion. And we know, linguists know, that language just borrow things back and forth all the time. So.
All right, I think we have time for one or two more questions. So if for some reason we are not able to get your question, you'd still like to ask it, you are also welcome to email Stephanie or myself and we can pass your questions along. But we do have a question from our collections and library specialist, who was doing research for a marine biology map of San Diego County, and she came across an article in American Antiquity that you wrote, Terry, in 1991 on marine resource value and the priority of coastal settlement, a California perspective, that was most helpful. Do you know of any more current research on ancient coastlines for this area?
For San Diego in general, or yeah, I'll tell you that maybe that person can email me and I'd be happy to send them a list of things. If they could be more specific about exactly what stretch of coast, I'd be happy to provide some sources. That might be the most efficient way.
Sure, she'll email you.
Okay.
We'll pass along. All right, and I think we have time for one more question. Given North America's strive for manifest destiny or being first, how much of a role do you think that plays in the denial and resistance of new and other theories presented, such as the Polynesian theory for contact with the Americas?
That's interesting. I'm going to give that one some thought. That's a good question, because we know what happened in North America, the genocide that happened during the manifest destiny era of American exploration and settlement. And I never really thought about that in terms of the Polynesians, but they were just looking for new uninhabited land to settle in, because those islands are pretty small and don't support a huge populations. So Terry?
It's an interesting idea. I think it definitely could have had an influence, certainly in the 19th century and into the 20th century. Probably among some, I hate to disparage historians, but perhaps among some more mainstream historians. I think anthropologists in the 20th century were always a little bit more enlightened in their perspective. I'm not sure they were beaten down by that. But I think that's an interesting question, and I certainly don't have a definitive answer, but I suspect that it may very well have influenced thinking in the 19th century, early 20th century. Yeah, possibly. Interesting question.
All right, well, thank you very much, Dr. Jones, and thank you, Dr. Carr, and thank you to everyone for attending tonight's living room lecture. Just as a reminder, our series continues in April with The Fishing Link, a new take on the coastal model of the peopling of the Americas. For more info on this and other upcoming events, please visit our website, sandiegoarchaeology.org. Thank you and good night.